This week on the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. Mercer, of course, with the military background, and Mercer himself was built like a tank. I mean, it looked like it was really hard to sneak punches on there that will do any damage to him. If you look at some of his fights in the mid-90s, the guy is in insane shape, built like a boulder. His neck looks about impossible to do any damage on. It really does look like it's carved out of granite. I mean, if you were to paint a picture of an ideal heavyweight, it would probably look a lot like Ray Mercer did at the peak of his career there in the mid-90s when he's taking on Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield.
Welcome back to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to preserving the history of boxing and its larger-than-life characters, and is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. Now, here's your host, Casey Kid History Callanan.
Hello, everybody. We are back for another exciting edition of the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing Merciless, Ray Mercer. Ray Mercer, a longtime American heavyweight and one of the best nicknames, in my humble opinion, in boxing history, Merciless. Maybe nothing more apropos than that, because as you'll see and hear later in this episode, Merciless Ray Mercer is responsible for one of the more brutal knockouts, one of the more merciless knockouts in boxing history, that taking place in 1991. And we'll get into a little bit of that later, but Merciless Ray Mercer was born in 1961. He's out of Jacksonville, Florida, where he was born, and he was a self-proclaimed military brat, meaning he had lived in a lot of different places within the United States, as his father was in the military. And Mercer himself actually served as well in the armed services for a while there before he really made a name for himself as a boxer, as an amateur boxer, when he entered the 1988 Summer Games taking place in Seoul, South Korea. He was actually named the Armed Forces Athlete of the Year in November of 1988, and the Army branch was known for producing a lot of Olympians, actually. In January of 1989, honorary discharge from the Army, and that was so he could pursue a full-time professional boxing career. So kind of an all-American story. He has the military background there in the late 80s, and then he becomes a gold medal winner at those 1988 Olympic Games in the heavyweight division. Merciless Ray Mercer gets the gold, and they never call him the golden boy. He's not as marketable, I guess, as Oscar De La Hoya was, who, after winning the Olympics, of course, was nicknamed the Golden Boy for the rest of his career. But Merciless Ray Mercer was this orthodox super heavyweight who not only boxed, but he also got involved in other forms of martial arts, most notably kickboxing and MMA. And we will get into his pretty incredible MMA debut, which he only had one fight under his belt in MMA, but that was a pretty impressive debut, and that happened in 2009, which we will touch on later. But I want to talk a little bit about Mercer's professional career in boxing, as that's obviously where he makes his name. In the mid-90s, there wasn't a bigger boxer in the division than Merciless Ray Mercer. That is obvious because he fought against Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis in back-to-back bouts in 95 and 96, and that was the pinnacle of his career. Unfortunately for Ray Mercer, he would never go on to be kind of a legend of the division because, casual boxing fans probably can't tell you a lot about Ray Mercer like they could tell you about Holyfield and Lewis. And Mercer certainly had his opportunities to solidify himself as an all-time great in 3 fights into the 2000s. So Mercer never delivered on those highest stages to really become you pass this threshold in boxing where casual fans know who you are. At least in America, there's only less than a handful of boxers your casual boxing fans who are also sports fans can probably name. And, Merciless Ray Mercer at that time probably wasn't into that kind of pop culture stratosphere yet. So it's important in the United States because it's a huge part of where money is earned in the sport. And unfortunately, right now, if you talk to probably casual fans, they could probably tell you about Deontay Wilder and maybe Tyson Fury, maybe AJ, and probably some of the guys in the smaller weight classes as well. Pacquiao and Mayweather, but that's about it. And I think it's really important as an American boxing supporter that we get more boxers who are known to the general public. Of course, Mercer never really, in my opinion, made that step into the big time as far as people in the mainstream knowing who he was, because every single time from about 1995 on, when he had an opportunity to really become next level, he wasn't able to deliver. He started his career out pretty spectacularly, jumping to 18-0, beating Tommy Morrison in 1991 was, as far as his undefeated record got, that was about as good as Mercer would get before losing to Larry Holmes in this next fight after he beat Morrison. In the Morrison fight, there's a viral knockout that takes place, and this is something that has been brought to the mainstream's attention as of late because powerful Joe Rogan, who's probably the top podcaster in the world by pure statistics, mentioned it in a recent podcast about how brutal that knockout was that Mercer delivered on Morrison. And when Rogan speaks on things like that, the videos tend to get a big bump on YouTube. And that's certainly the case in this one, because if you Google Ray Mercer, the first thing that kind of pops up is his knockout of Tommy Morrison. And what happened in that fight was Morrison got kind of was losing, and then he got pretty much knocked out. And while he was knocked out, and you could tell in the replay he wasn't moving, he gets kind of hung up on the ropes. So instead of going down as one would do when they are knocked out, borderline unconscious, you would fall, your legs would give out and you fall. But Morrison gets caught up in the ropes in this particular knockout, and there's nowhere for him to go. And, it's easy to blame, it's easy to point fingers at the ref in this situation because he is a little late to the punch, so to speak. And, the ref doesn't jump in time. And unfortunately for Tommy Morrison, he takes 2 haymakers in a row while his eyes are closed and he's hung up on the ropes. So the referee does not get there in time, and Merciless Ray Mercer, really living up to his nickname in this knockout, really destroys Tommy Morrison in this 1991 bout taking place in Atlantic City. But, credit to Tommy Morrison. His career after that vicious knockout is not over. We have an episode about Tommy Morrison as well, if you ever want to check that out, clearcontender.com/podcast. But Tommy Morrison makes a massive comeback after this. A lesser fighter would have not been able to come back from this vicious, all-time historic knockout. But Morrison does come back. He wins like 10 straight bouts after this, including a unanimous decision over George Foreman, who was in the midst of an incredible career comeback. That's right. After Morrison gets knocked out, he comes back and strings together a bunch of victories, including a huge win over George Foreman in 1993. So a tip of the cap to Tommy Morrison I want to give on this episode, because as viral and as memorable as that Ray Mercer knockout is over Tommy Morrison, again, Joe Rogan calling it maybe like the most vicious knockout in boxing history, Morrison, the champion that he is, comes back and wins the WBO heavyweight title after that. So you gotta give credit where credit is due. And of course, later on in Morrison's career, he would win another heavyweight title over Razor Ruddock, the great Canadian. So, that is something that I want to point out in this interview, in this podcast, because sure, Ray Mercer delivers incredible damage to Tommy Morrison, and the ref, slowly doesn't see that Morrison is knocked out, and he's slow to end the fight. Nothing makes me more upset than a referee that doesn't stop a fight on time. Fighter safety is something that should be near and dear to all fight fans' hearts, especially what we know in 2020 about the brain damage and all of that horrible things. So nothing upsets me more than when a ref is slow to end a fight, because a lot of these warrior type individuals are not going to give up. A lot of their corners are not going to throw in the towel, and we need refs that are willing to get in there and stop fights. And of course, when you stop a fight early, you prevent perhaps that fighter from being able to come back, and we won't see an epic, fight like you would see in a Ward Gotti trilogy. But, that's a small price to pay for fighter safety. So I am still in favor of refs getting in there and stopping fights. I would rather see them stop fights early than see what the heck happened in this Ray Mercer knockout of Tommy Morrison. It's very, very disturbing. So after Merciless, Ray Mercer defeats Tommy Morrison. Again, at this time, he will go on to fight Larry Holmes, who in my opinion is the greatest heavyweight champion in boxing that came after Muhammad Ali. I think Larry Holmes is the best, and that's my opinion. I think he was better than anyone else in the heavyweight division. And just because he wasn't as flashy as some of the other guys that came around, perhaps he wasn't as marketable as some of the other fighters that came after him, some of the other heavyweights. Larry Holmes probably doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. But in my opinion, the fighting pride of Easton, Pennsylvania, is the best heavyweight fighter since Muhammad Ali, and we haven't had one as good in the division since Holmes retires. So Holmes beats Mercer in 1992, and then Mercer loses again in 93 to Jesse Ferguson. He does avenge that loss later that year, but then he has those two big, huge bouts that, you win those, you're a heavyweight champion, and you're also going to be, making insane amount of money. You're going to start bringing in pay-per-view dollars. The general public is going to know you. You're going to be on the late night television shows. But in 1995 and 1996, he loses to Evander Holyfield and then Lennox Lewis. So Mercer still has a shot at the big time in 2002 when in Atlantic City he gets a title shot against Vladimir Klitschko. He gets TKO'd in the 6th round in June of 2002. And again, he gets another big fight taking place at the Hard Rock in Hollywood, Florida, losing to Shannon Briggs. In 2005, of course, at this time, he's very much over the hill as a heavyweight. But what was cool and interesting is after that kind of boxing career winds down in the early 2000s for Mercer, he decides to jump into kickboxing, losing his only 2 kickboxing matches. And then he gets involved in a exhibition match against Kimbo Slice, the legendary street fighter who is no longer with us. Actually, Kimbo Slice has passed away. But Kimbo Slice submits Mercer when they fight in an exhibition mixed martial arts cage fight. Again, Kimbo Slice winning by way of guillotine choke. And then the really interesting thing that happens when you're like, okay, Mercer has not been able to cross over into kickboxing or mixed martial arts successfully. It looks like his career is really completely over in that. But then in 2009, at the age of 48, Mercer takes on Tim Sylvia in a MMA fight. And this is really an incredible event because I don't think anyone really expected Mercer to win this one over Tim Sylvia. Tim Sylvia, of course, having a long career as a UFC heavyweight champion. He's a 2-time former UFC heavyweight champion, and kind of all bets are against, Mercer winning this fight. But out of nowhere, Mercer does knock out Tim Sylvia in the first 9 seconds of this fight. And it's just kind of head-scratching how that happened. Because if you look at UFC 1, just for example, when they were trying to figure out which was the best martial art, what was going to be supreme, they had a boxer going against, I believe, in UFC 1, it was a boxer matched up against Royce Gracie, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu versus boxing was very lopsided, and Royce Gracie really easily beat the boxer. So in this fight, you've got a boxing legend, Ray Mercer, who is well into his 40s, almost 50 years old, with very little mixed martial arts experience, taking on a former UFC heavyweight champion. And what happens in this one is what maybe some of us expected to happen in UFC 1, and that was the boxer landed a haymaker square to the face, and that was all she wrote. So again, it's really hard for boxers to sometimes have success in mixed martial arts because they are kind of one-dimensional inside that octagon, where it's really just like if they don't land a haymaker, they're not going to win the fight. But Ray Mercer does land the haymaker, and he lands it within the first 10 seconds on Tim Sylvia, and he knocks out the big fella in one of the more unexpected events in the history of mixed martial arts. Just when you think there's nothing that, Ray Mercer has left in the tank, he goes ahead and shockingly knocks out Tim Sylvia. Mercer, of course, with the military background, and Mercer himself was built like a tank. I mean, it looked like it was really hard to sneak punches on there that will do any damage to him. If you look at some of his fights in the mid-90s, the guy is in insane shape, built like a boulder. His neck looks about impossible to do any damage on. It really does look like it's carved out of granite. I mean, if you were to paint a picture of an ideal heavyweight, it would probably look a lot like Ray Mercer did at the peak of his career there in the mid-90s when he's taking on Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield. Listen, Ray Mercer was a huge underdog in that fight against Lennox Lewis in 1996 at Madison Square Garden. Merciless Ray Mercer put together one of the best fights of his career, and he was really doing some damage on Lewis, and unfortunately the narrow victory for Lewis was a little controversial because Mercer landed a higher percentage of total punches, and he landed 60% of his jabs, and Lewis only landed, according to, I think, CompuBox numbers, 33% of his jabs. So, honestly, that was a very controversial decision, and Ray Mercer, look, at the end of the day, Ray Mercer is an underrated champion. We talk about Larry Holmes being underrated earlier in this episode, and rightfully so. Larry Holmes, in my opinion, was like top of the top. But Merciless Ray Mercer needs to have an episode on the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast, because this guy a lot of times did not get decisions, did not get things that he should have got for how good he was, how much substance he brought to the table. Merciless Ray Mercer, certainly one of the most fearsome fighters that ever lived in the heavyweight division, and we had to throw out an important episode of the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast, giving him some love today. For more episodes, please visit us on clearcontender.com/podcast. I also want to remind you to hook up some reviews on Apple Podcasts if you enjoyed these episodes. All right, we'll see you next time, my friends.
Thanks for listening to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. For more, visit us on clearcontender.com.